This presentation is going to address tree selection and placement in the urban environment. Now, selection impacts the success of any tree planting, regardless of where it's at. Matching the site with the species is a critical step in the overall planting protocol. It's going to affect the long-term benefits of the plant, as well as the maintenance input that goes into keeping that tree alive. So what I'm going to talk about here in this presentation is more about how to select the right tree for the right place, and also some of those site-specific considerations that goes into the process. Now, one thing about the urban environment and tree planting in urban conditions is, let's face it, it's a tough neighborhood in the built environment. It's an ecosystem unlike any other because it's dynamic, it's fragmented, it's highly pressured, constantly under siege, and there is a continual disruption to that environment as opposed to, say, the more natural wooded ecosystem. It's no wonder trees in the downtown and built environment yield such short-lived trees. We have very poor soil structure, limited soil volumes, alternating flooding, droughting, salt sprays, chemical poisoning of the soil, temperature extremes. You know, it's a wonder trees survive at all. But trees don't get to be the oldest, largest living organism on our planet without having some specific strategies on how to survive. But when we get to the challenges of the built environment, it gets a little more difficult for that tree to live a long life that is sustainable, healthy, and safe in order to provide those functional benefits that we so desperately need. Now, when selecting a plant, really it comes down to what is the purpose for that planting. We need to plan for what function or role that tree is going to perform in its place. So if you know why you're planting the tree, that's going to help a lot with what to plant. There, we have a lot of choices available to us as far as uh, picking a tree for a landscape planting site or an urban tree site. But choosing the right tree that's going to live a long time for us is a little more challenging. And so we need to narrow it down to more of a short list that performs well under those conditions. The aesthetic effects are relatively easy, and we can choose trees based on some of those beautiful qualities that that they possess. But we need to think about the functional role. Again, how's that tree going to perform? And also the design impact relative to neighboring infrastructure, buildings, sidewalks, and other landscape plants and tree plantings as well. This is our goal. We want to improve the benefits of trees and the functional role that they provide in the landscape. We have all heard and seen many of these things that trees provide. They're the perfect biological machine that will help improve our environment and our living conditions and quality of life. But more importantly, these two items here, water filter and air filter, are two, to me, that are personally incredibly vital, especially in Indiana, where, according to the recent rankings that I have researched, is that Indiana ranks 46 out of 50 states in air and water quality. And it's not getting any better. So it's not necessarily planting more trees, but maintaining those trees that we have and try to reduce the number that we're losing to attrition and urban sprawl and development as much as possible. But when we do have the opportunity to plant trees, we need to make sure we plant, select, and place them in the right situations. Now, there's a couple of things that I look at. I look at it from a large scale and then a more of a site-specific scale. With environmental conditions, we've kind of addressed those a little bit. We need to think about the available light, which usually isn't an issue in the urban environment, but we need to think about microclimates, sun exposure. Are there any wind tunnels, heat islands, those types of things? Are they more subject to pollution in a particular area of a community? So those things will provide some input as far as what trees will be compatible with that site. But more importantly, we need to think about more site-specific considerations, for example, pH and how that will affect availability to plant nutrients. Soil type, maybe, but more importantly, soil texture, the amount of sand, silt, and clay, because that's going to have an impact on pH, going to have an impact on water holding capacity, nutrient availability. All those things will be considered when it comes to soil. And also the texture in relationship to its friability. Is it compacted or is it a decent quality texture so that it does support good root growth? Drainage is a big one, especially in those compacted soil areas. You can see a couple of examples here. The middle picture here is a planting site in a new athletic complex, and that water had been in that planting hole for 3 days. So obviously there's going to very compacted, perhaps not compatible with the tree planting, so special planting protocols are going to be necessary. And that's not uncommon in a lot of built environments. And then existing plantings, even on a residential scale, we want to make sure that our watering regime is compatible with the drainage and water holding capacity. A soil probe is such a handy tool to get in there and determine, does a tree need water? You really can't tell with mulch and so forth on top. And the response of the plant, the plant can turn chlorotic and necrotic from being too dry and too wet. So getting in there and checking the soil will help you in that establishment and maintenance of that tree and determining water needs as well. Making sure the site is sustainable and compatible for trees. This is one that I happened to run across, tree planting near the Purdue campus. And you can see that obviously not likely a sustainable site for those trees under those conditions. But this is what we're typically faced with. And, the infrastructure conflicts that are present already prior to planting on top of the irrigation and water pipes. And then of course, nearby sidewalks, and not to mention the soil or lack of soil, are going to surely create some health and stability issues in this particular situation. And when it comes to sustainability, proper planting space, especially in relationship to soil volume, plays a major role in that tree's sustainability. This was a planting project that my urban forestry students at Purdue participated in Chicago. And this is not unusual to see. This is actually quite normal to see this 4x4 allotment of planting space for a tree. And usually they're about 4 feet deep. Now the question is this a sustainable location for that tree that will support good rooting and volume for that tree to develop and grow in size to gets to a point where it does perform to its potential and provide those functional roles that we are planting that tree for. But really what it comes down to is that rooting volume and that soil volume that I look at more critically now than anything based on current research. Basically what it comes down to is that inadequate rooting space or soil volume will lead to mortality. Um, we, we often in municipal plantings in urban areas, it's a delicate balance trying to come up with meeting the biological needs of the tree or the plant and the demands of the infrastructure. And oftentimes we try to force or get the tree to comply with what we have available rather than creating space especially for those trees and working around the infrastructure and biological needs of the tree. So what we need to look at is, let's go back to our tree planting that we had here. So let's say that planting space is 4x4 wide, and then 4 feet deep. So that's 64 cubic feet of soil. Now, if it's a good, nice clay loam soil there, like perhaps you see there next to it, um, it will hold roughly 48 gallons of water at field capacity. A tree that size with a nice healthy crown will usually use through its physiological processes anywhere from 12 to 20 gallons of water daily. So in 4 short days, that tree is going to basically have exhausted all of its water resources. And without any additional or supplemental watering, that tree is going to be drought stressed and perhaps entering that mortality spiral. And so as a result, the tree is just going to be constantly under stress as a result of inadequate moisture. So I like to think of the planting space, especially in those urban areas like we continually see, as that little planting space or whatever it has available to it is basically its canteen. And so when that canteen is empty, we got to fill it up or it doesn't have enough water to survive. And so we have to realize or acknowledge that without these adequate soil volumes, I realize that we may not have space enough to give due to pedestrian traffic and so forth. But we need to realize and anticipate those additional inputs that are going to be required, which primarily is supplemental water. Water is the single most ecologically limiting component in a tree's survival. And so we need to think about basically what I call the 2-to-1 rule. And this was based on some research done at Cornell University, where best growth and survival and sustainability occurs whenever you have at least 2 cubic feet of soil for every square foot of canopy. Now, we don't always get that. When I had the opportunity to work with planners or communities on planning for tree planting, they'll say, well, how much do you need or how much do you want? Well, I'll take what I can get, but we need to remember that the very livelihood of that tree is going to be based upon the amount of soil volume that it has. So the more we have, the better it's going to survive. And the less likely it's going to need additional maintenance inputs. This is what we would like to see, but not always available to it. This is another tree planting in Chicago where they plan for better sustainability there with increased soil volume. And that additional space is going to improve the health and longevity of all those trees. This is the beginnings of a rain garden to try to help manage some stormwater in the downtown area. And you can see they have some cutouts here for drainage off the impervious surfaces. Hopefully this area will support drainage. Otherwise it could be just a giant swimming pool for those trees. But again, that increased soil volume means there's increased water potential there for that tree to survive. And placement is another consideration. These are some examples of things I don't like to see. And I'll start with the evergreens first on the bookends here. Um, White pines are notably intolerant to road salt and pollution for that matter. And these are planted along high-speed roads, so the salt spray will desiccate that foliage. In fact, the one on the left is completely dead. And then also the sweet gum here um, over the stormwater inlet is what I call the perfect stormwater management concept, but not realistic because it's certainly going to cause some infrastructure conflicts in very short order. And then the coffee tree here next to the bike path. Again, they moved it over to the point where it wouldn't be a conflict with the utilities, but it's literally only about 9 or 10 inches from the curb. And I can understand why the metropolitan development planners and so forth um, have some angst when it comes to people screaming for more trees when we do stuff like this. It's certainly not compatible with that curb and streets, so it's going to cause problems. And then also, on the right here, we see this vestigiate white pine growing I realized, the explanation to me was it only gets 8 feet wide. Well, that planting space is only about 4 feet, so it's going to overcome that space very quickly. And where it becomes an issue is as far as safety. It's going to grow into the sidewalk. It's already growing over the curb, as you can see there. So that creates a real safety issue in my mind as a line of sight issue. If somebody wants to cross the road or runs through across the road, they cannot see, car can't see them. So, there's some inherent issues there. And I certainly understand the effort there because just like in this image, as far as line of sight, we in the temperate areas, we want some evergreen interest, especially in the winter, and to create some diversity there. But evergreens typically aren't very compatible with urban tree plantings. They can block signs and block line of sight, create utility issues, infrastructure conflicts as well. You can see up here on this upper right, there is a stop sign behind that beautiful maple, which can create the perfect opportunity for an accident. So it's not that the tree's not in the right place or it's a poor selection. It's just we've also got to plan for another maintenance input, which is raising the crown in order to improve visibility there. So pruning, watering, two very important establishment and maintenance concerns for tree plantings. And also just the simple sidewalk panel lifting can be an issue as well. Trip and falls are a major concern in communities. And, we need to do some research as far as selection based on some of the silviculture manuals that we have and understanding how trees grow in their natural environment. Riparian trees are notably shallow-rooted trees, and we plant sycamores and some maples in urban dry areas. They're going to be shallow-rooted. That's just how they grow. So they're going to have lifting of panels and cause infrastructure conflicts where our more upland mesic soil trees tend to be more deep rooted. And so as a result, the roots dive deeper, which are less likely to cause infrastructure conflict. So just looking at the genetic capacity of those trees and how they naturally grow can have a major impact on our selection and sustainability of those plantings. Of course, in municipalities, we also need to look at clearance and ADA compliance. I think the ADA compliance for pedestrians is 8 feet. And then on the street side, we need to look at compatibility with trash service and mass transit to make sure that the buses and so forth can get through their delivery trucks. We need to make sure that we select trees that grow proportionately to allow those clearances. So, I've seen a lot of communities plant crab apples and smaller understory trees in those locations, and those certainly aren't long-term solutions for tree plantings for streets. We need the taller growing large canopy trees in order to be compliant with access, but also can tolerate the pruning that is necessary to maintain that compliance. So really we need to know before we plant what's going on below ground and above ground. We often think we do know, and I've seen this accident happen way more than I'd like, but we need to know where those utilities are. And planting trees in order to hide utilities also don't work very well because the utility service providers are very keen about proximity of trees to utility lines. And we need to look at what type of utilities are present and also make sure we always call 811 prior to any planning or planting. Otherwise, this is what we run into when trees and utilities collide, so to speak. And usually, it's not the fault of the tree or the utility. It's usually the results of us planting trees where they shouldn't be. But like with this situation, The trees were already there, but due to the demands from the utilities, new infrastructure and hardware has to be installed. And so we try to make those trees compliant with clearance requirements, but oftentimes it doesn't work. So pruning is necessary, but oftentimes it may be the fact that we just may need to replace and replant with trees that are more compatible with that situation. But utility foresters are very much the tree hugger types and do their best to try to get adjacent tree owners and utilities working together. They spend millions of dollars on information and education for both above ground and below ground utilities, trying to um, allow trees to be compatible nearby utilities. Again, oftentimes it's great to work with them in that process. They have foresters that work in every community and can provide some resources in order to make sure that you have trees that aren't going to be negatively impacted by the demands of utility vegetation management. Um, New construction also prevents new challenges for trees. Oftentimes we don't always get this perspective, but it gives us some insight on some of the growing conditions that we'll see for trees. This allows us to get an idea of drainage patterns, the type of drainage that we have for that particular soil in those areas, get an idea of where utilities are located, future uh, um, homes or buildings are going in. But again, getting an overall look at the entire site is going to have a major impact on long-term growth of those trees, and especially looking at the impact of construction on soils. Soil texture is often destroyed and compacted as a result. Building materials, and usually it's the the impacts of that heavy equipment on those planting spaces. We often see very fragmented, blocky texture. Oftentimes, the native soil is completely removed and replaced with this. What this is actually dirt, not soil. Also on new buildings and construction, irrigation will go in. Make sure that's mapped because oftentimes that's not included in utility location or in their processes. And of course, we never want to plant trees over utilities. You can see that red dot there. That was actually going to be a tree planting until they were convinced otherwise. So again, safety and sustainability is very important for that overall successful tree planting. All right, now let's get into the specific types of nursery stocks and the issues that we need to consider there. Lots of different types of tree medium available to you. Bare root, container, balled and burlap. And then we also have the root enhancement pots and containers that are becoming more prevalent and certainly help to reduce some of the stem girdling root issues that are inherent with smooth wall containers. But by and large, really when it comes down to plant selection is it's like anything else, you get what you pay for in the fact that good quality nurseries, reputable resources are so very important. We want to make sure we look at the branch infrastructure and just how they're maintained in their holding area. Usually the big box stores don't receive quality materials, and we often have poor branch structure like you see here on this red maple, and certainly not a tree I would plant, and it's going to require some serious structural pruning. But oftentimes the trees are stressed. They're not maintained or watered as they would be at a professional nursery. So again, you get what you pay for. Inspect the root system, see how long they've been held, and what kind of growing conditions they have, and look for any pest issues or nutritional issues. But again, when you buy from a reputable nursery source, you typically don't have those problems. So let's first talk about one of the, again, major types of plant sources available to us, balled and burlap materials. These have their advantages. They also have significant disadvantages. One of the advantages is that oftentimes we can get larger trees, and also there's typically more selection available, although a lot of our most of our landscape plants are now pretty much containerized. Some disadvantages of this is, one, they are extremely heavy. A 2.5 to 3 inch caliper tree can weigh anywhere between 250 and 400 pounds. So not easily planted for most people. One of the more significant issues is considering the root zone. Now, let's a little bit of refresher on tree roots. Remember, they extend at least to the drip line, and we also know that they can go 2 to 3 times past the drip line of the tree, where you can see it growing here. And they're usually only 12 to 18 inches deep, maybe more, depending upon how compacted the subsoil is. But once a tree's dug, this is about all the root system it gets. So it's been said that anywhere between 80 and 90% of the existing root system is left behind when a tree's dug. Now, if you're not familiar with the process, um, this is a nursery where they're digging service berries, but you can see that they use a tree spade to basically spade down. Nursery standards indicate that, I think that it's for every inch of caliper tree, um, it's required to have at least 10 inches of soil balls. So for example, for a 2-inch tree, you would have about a 20 to 24-inch soil ball, as you can see here. So basically the tree's lifted out of its growing point, and then placed into the burlap, held together by the galvanized wires. So again, this is the problem in the fact that, again, about 85 to 90% of the roots are actually left behind in the process. And the results are this, as we saw earlier, and then our class dissected the root system, or excuse me, deconstructed the root system of the tree, and you can see this is all that's left behind. I mean, it amazes me that that root system can regenerate, um, and create and establish a new root system that sustains that tree as it establishes and grows. So again, um, the inherent issue is the lack of rooting system. So we have to be very cautious and careful during that planting process, so that we don't damage or impair the root system any more than it already is. Now, container grown plants have some advantages, and they also have their disadvantages as well. They're available year round for planting, whereas burlap, ball and burlap materials are typically dug in the spring, and then based on anticipated demand. There is some fall digging, but the majority of the trees that are balled and burlap are what's available in the spring is all you have. So procuring those plants based on size and planting medium is important to realize whenever you're speccing those out and planning for future plantings. Now, with container grown plants, it's in a very more lightweight medium, much easier to handle. These 1.5-inch trees you can pick up with one hand. The problematic issues are they are smooth walled round containers, so they become what we call root bound in the pots, which creates some issues of circling roots or stem girdling roots. The containers, depending upon how they're managed, do generate heat because of the black plastic. But by and large, our issues can be summed up into poor root growth and some overall health issues as a result of that. So because the seed, it's basically the plant's grown from seed to source in that in a container. So it it presents these root issues with this continual circling of those roots. And then what we have is basically poor root symmetry for the lateral development of those roots growing out. fewer main lateral roots, and basically just a increased potential for tree death and failure. This was a maple tree that was planted along street in Lafayette, West Lafayette, a few years ago. And this was 3 years after planting, and you can see that major lateral root, which should be laterally growing into its new host environment, continued that circling dynamic. You can see one escaped and is growing out into its new host soil. But again, it's almost like the tree is genetically coded to continue to grow in that circle, and this is what we see. Now, if the tree doesn't perish as a result of the girdling and just choking out its vascular system, the other issue is that it never gets out of its prepared planting pit. And so it doesn't expand its reservoir of moisture, water availability, and nutrient availability. And basically, it just declines or goes into that mortality spiral. And as a result, it just eventually declines and dies. So, again, um, get, getting in there prior to planting and affecting some modifications to those containerized plants can help that tree become faster established and more sustainable. Now, the whole summary of going from tree selection from source to the city involves some critical thinking here, and some important points I'd like to summarize as we finish up on this particular section is make sure that we have the infrastructure in that planting space that will sustain that tree. Making sure that we have proper soil volumes, and that we're not getting into utilities or going to have future issues with other hardscape. And choose trees that are known to survive that location. And there's a lot of anecdotal information in there, but there's a lot of research going on currently, especially in some of those areas in the world that are affected by severe drought right now. They're researching um, trees that are surviving drought conditions based on their physiological processes, as far as how whether they tolerate drought or avoid drought, and how they accommodate those conditions. So there's a lot of new research that's going on how trees survive dry conditions. Also, being realistic with maintenance expectations and addressing those right at the beginning of any planting project in any community. You know, the availability of funding for tree plantings is certainly important, but only one component. We need to make sure that we not only allocate money for the planting process, but also allocate funding for the establishment period as well. And usually that's about 2 to 3 years before we can allow trees to start to manage themselves, and have expanded into their environment enough to expand their availability of resources, which is water and nutrients. And then, so like this kind of goes for opting for trees that are known to survive that location, is selecting plants based on performance in that location rather than its pedigree um, or its aesthetic qualities, I should say. So we want to make sure that, yeah, we want certain fall color flowers and things like that, but good, sustainable, healthy performance on that site and longevity is much more critical importance as far as functional roles on that site as well. Um, Native trees, I hear this constantly, go native, plant more native trees, but there are other non-invasive options and cultivars being created and researched and selected right now. In fact, some of these cultivars are better suited and grown for the built environment. Let me ask you, what is native about the urban forest? Absolutely nothing. Trees perform well in their native environment because it's a lot less stressed ecosystem, and they just may not do well in the built environment. So let's think about choosing trees again on how they perform, but we want to make sure we don't plant something that's invasive and creating a bigger problem or headache for our community later on. And diversity on every site and scale is important. It's not just about what's going on in your city, but what's going on in neighboring cities and towns, and thinking regionally and rather than just locally. Even in a subdivision, looking at the plant palette and the list to see what's being specified for that area. And oftentimes engineers and contractors and planners aren't as well versed in understanding the impacts of diversity and pest issues and maintenance expectations as are the urban foresters and the landscape managers and the arborists. And what I like to call well-defended plants. Certain plants are just known to be more prone or susceptible to insects and diseases. For example, certain species like the oaks, they have roughly about 260 known diseases and insects. Some are better at overcoming those issues in high pressure populations. um, Prunus species are one of the worst. Cherry trees I think there's over 450 known pests and as far as diseases and insects. So, choosing those plants with have fewer pests, for example, like the ginkgos, actually basswood, Tilia, have a lot fewer pests. Amermachia, coffee tree. There are a lot of other plants that are much more compatible in high pressure, high stress areas that lead to increased pest populations. So finally, again, increase the number of genera used in the landscape, not just species. And it's a responsibility for the entire green industry. It's really about supply and demand when it comes down to it. Um, if we start demanding or specifying trees that aren't necessarily popular or again have the pedigree to be grown more, then the nursery industry is not going to grow it, and understandably so. So if we start asking more for these plants that are better performers and less susceptible to pests and perform better in the urban environment than some of the others, then they'll start growing more. So it's a kind of a shared responsibility there as far as growing and selecting plants. And I think it's important for all of us to understand that, and also being cognizant of that site diversity and its relationship to the type of plant tree that we're providing to that in that community. And again, not getting overwhelmed with the type of tree species that we're planting as far as their susceptibilities to insect pests. We didn't learn our lesson from, back in the 50s with the Dutch elm disease and with ash trees. And I am guilty of planting a lot of ash trees in my career. But when we aren't diverse in our selections and planting them, this is what the results become. We run into situations where once the trees, the pressure of the insect population gets to the point that it starts destroying all of our ash trees or all of a certain species of tree, we have many more invasive pests coming our way soon. We're going to be constantly under pressure and siege, and it's incumbent upon us as tree managers to be aware of what's coming and be prepared for that. And the best way is to increase the number of genera used in our landscape and be cognizant of that overall plant diversity. And be aware of what those issues are with any plant. It's not just ornamental pear. There are a lot of landscape plants that have escaped their planted environment. I can name ornamental pears, barberries, buckthorn, winter creeper, English ivy, and the list goes on. I mean, when you walk out into the woods and you see these landscape plants, you're wondering what are they doing here? Well, that's the invasive nature of those, and we don't want to perpetuate that. So just be aware of those plants that you know have known issues, and try to steer away from those whenever possible. So really it comes down to beginning with the end in mind, as Dr. Stephen Covey quoted in his book, 7 Habits for Highly Effective People. Um, Knowing the appropriate species that performs well on that site. And I know we've heard this and say this time and time again, but it still rings true so well as right tree, right place in the right way. And then, proper planning to get the positive growth to perform those functional roles in our communities, with the supportive infrastructure and soil volume. And as I tell the landscape planners, having spatial realism, making sure that we have enough space, not just below ground, but above ground, so that it's compatible with the neighboring buildings and infrastructure, street lights, stoplights, utility lines, all those things. And of course, being realistic with the management inputs that's going to be available for that tree to sustain it for a long, healthy life. So just some resources to finish up here that are available to you. FNR 531 is available at the Purdue Education Store for some lists and some also to talk a little bit more about what I discussed in this presentation. And there's also an accompanying video that can be helpful in training and learning a little bit more about choosing the right tree for the right place. Also, there's a accompanying resource for tree installation, which also talks about tree selection as well, and also a video that's available to you on how to plant a tree properly, focusing primarily on balled and burlap and containerized trees. And finally, if you haven't signed up for the Purdue Landscape Report, it's a biweekly newsletter that goes out either via email list, or you can find us on Facebook as well. Great resource for current and emerging issues with trees, shrubs, and plants in the landscape, maintenance training. There's all sorts of information for every green industry professional, as well as the tree owner at home as well. So finally, I'd like to thank the Indiana Department of Natural Resources and the Indiana Arborist Association for their support in providing these webinars. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email us at info@indianaarborist.org, and hopefully we can help you with any resources you might need. Thank you.